Thank you for waiting. I'm sorry to keep you. One of our speakers is in a taxi from the airport. If you've been outside, you know it's not the right place to be right now, but it's imminent. We won't wait any longer. We'll start the Thomas School sleeping. I'll begin by introducing our Dean, Professor Simon Bonnet. Thank you.
Inikalawagan Mari Biduri Karinurda. In the land of our first peoples from this part of Australia, the Gadigal, I welcome you. I'm not Indigenous, but I have learned this from my dear friend, Professor Jackie Troy. And Jackie has played a very significant role as a linguist, recovering and preserving the Gadigal language. Meeting on this beautiful country, we are so privileged, and giving an acknowledgement as a non-Indigenous person at this particular moment has particular significance. No doubt, as everyone is well aware, the referendum result has had a very significant impact on our First Nations peoples, and this law school, I'm very proud to say, over 3.5 years ago, endorsed the Uluru Statement. Unfortunately, the rest of the country didn't catch up, but look, the work in relation to remedying disadvantage, honouring our First Nations continues, and certainly I think this law school has made a very strong commitment to that mission. So I'd like to not only acknowledge First Nations, pay respects to Indigenous people in the room, to elders past, present and emerging, but also welcome you to this event, the 2023 Kim Santow Law and Social Justice Panel, which poses a question: is there a looming crisis in social justice recruitment? Obviously, I'd also like to acknowledge Simon Rice, who obviously is in the Kim Santow chair, and I would like to just introduce Simon. There's a lot of Simons in this school. It's a little bit confusing at times, but Simon is a lawyer, advocate, consultant and academic, working and researching extensively in anti-discrimination law, human rights, access to justice, law reform, legal education, Aboriginal land rights, and organisational strategy. So I've known Simon for, how long? 20 years? Yeah, 20 years. We worked together at ANU, and certainly I was delighted when I became the Dean to find there's another couple of Simons, both of whom had ANU connections. Is Simon Butt here? One of our professors as well. So Simon holds as I said, the Kim Santow Chair of Law and Social Justice. Simon is well known, I'm sure, to most of the attendees tonight. Teaches on legal ethics, law reform, social justice, public interest law, and the criminal trial. He has a most amazing course where students are thrown into a real immersive and experiential opportunity to experience a criminal trial. Of course, he also researches in the areas of anti-discrimination law, human rights, access to justice, and legal education. On top of all that, as well as litigating against New South Wales Police Service, he also, as one knows, in relation to challenging some of the excessive use of force in our state, he also has worked in practice and in relation to the law firm Chalk and Barrett, where again he practices in anti-discrimination, human rights, Aboriginal land rights, and native title. And of course he is also on the board of the Welfare Rights. So please let me hand over the mic to Simon, who will now introduce the panel.
Thank you, Simon.
No worries.
Thank you, Simon, and welcome everybody. A special welcome to the Santow family. 3 generations of the Santow family here for an event which commemorates Kim Santow, Chancellor of Sydney University, one-time Chancellor of Sydney University, Judge of the New South Wales Supreme Court, partner for the Holdingdale and Page, as I think it was then called, and a real inspiration to generations of lawyers who could see that law could be done intelligently and kindly, generously, and with great ability. And it's a privilege to be able to hold a chair in his name and to commemorate his name here today. I saw a print out of the audience, who you all are, and it's wonderful that you're here from such a diverse background. And what I saw was that people come from all sorts of sectors. And I think it's because this proposition, this question really engages people. Right now, employment and what we're calling social justice. I had to explain that to someone today. I said, what do you mean social justice? I said, well, not for profit, public interest, for purpose, basically non-commercial. And that's a tough gig these days. So the question is posed and has attracted a lot of interest. I've been asked whether we could Zoom it. I said no, but people wanted to Zoom in from around Australia and from London, so they'll get the recording. To address the question, we're really privileged to have an eminent panel, which is about to be complete as Thomas arrives. Thank you. So in no particular order, but as you're looking at them from your left, I'll just briefly introduce now each of the panelists and then we'll get into the question and answer. Rosa Lauria is the CEO of Sydney Multicultural Community Services, and Rosa and I have known each other since we worked in the community 40 odd years ago, and she is indefatigable. Next to Rosa, we're very privileged to have Australia's relatively new Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Anna Cody. Next to Anna is Ben McAlpine, who is the acting CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service. Next to Ben is Emily Hamilton, who is the Advocacy and Communications Manager at Community Legal Centres Australia, the peak body for CLCs in Australia. And next to Emily is Thomas Costa, who is the Assistant Secretary of Unions New South Wales. Missing from the panel is the student voice. I'm sorry, the president of the National Union of Students, as of earlier today, was unavailable. So we don't have what I think is a very important perspective, the student voice. I think there are some students here, perhaps they could chime up when we get to questions. We will get to questions, so I'm going to help the panel address this issue from their various perspectives. I hope it'll be reasonably interactive among them. We'll do that for about an hour, and then questions. I'll chair the questions, brief to the point, and we'll get answers. And then, with a few minutes to go, we'll stop and I will take pleasure in announcing the winner of the Kim Santow Social Justice Essay Prize for this year. So we'll do that at the end. It may be distracting to you, I'm sorry, but the captions there real-time captions for people who have difficulty hearing. For those who find them distracting, it's an accommodation that we will make for those who need them. So, the question, is there a looming crisis in social justice recruitment? When we formulated the question, I actually debated with my colleagues on the Social Justice Committee whether it was a looming one or a real one, or we thought, no, let's say it's there, and it's, I think one of my colleagues said it's looming at us like a truck coming towards us. So I'm going to ask Thomas perhaps to lead off with a bit of an overview of an industrial perspective on this, your union's perspective on this question, if you could.
Thank you, and my apologies again for being late. I was caught up on a delayed flight. I was really excited to be invited to this panel because the question is one that really is something we deal with in the union movement as well every day, because we're not just advocates for workers, we're also employers and people who want to work in social justice, and finding good people who want to come and work for us now is harder than it has been ever before. And I do think, just picking up on your point, Simon, that it isn't a looming crisis. I think we are at a crisis point. And I say that because when I look around the people that work for me who are incredibly talented and work really hard, but then I also look at community legal centres that I share my building with and their staff as well. Almost all of the staff, apart from senior leaders, are under 35. And the reality is most of them will not stay working in social justice for much longer. And when I think about the question from sort of Labor perspective, why is this? I think I can break it down into a number of different points, but all of them come under one major heading, which is it's neoliberalism, right? Like we have an economy that has driven markets through everything, and it's driven up prices. We see cost of living rising, we see house prices rising, but it's also driven down the relative wages of workers, and particularly young professionals, but even more particularly young professionals going into the not-for-profit sector and into social justice. Very few professionals in these sectors are working above award wages, very few. The award wages don't go up anywhere near as much as the cost of living is going up. And then on top of that, they're tied into funding arrangements, which usually limit their working contracts to 3 years. And that's another precarity that we're sort of placing on top of these workers. And I think those things would be able to be overcome if there was some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And for the reason why I think we're in the crisis now is that light just doesn't seem to be there, because when you look at this workforce and you look at what they're looking for secure jobs. They know that it's so hard to get secure jobs in their sector, but it's also really hard to get secure jobs outside of their sector, which means those jobs are more in demand. So you might work in the social justice sector for 10, 15 years, confident that you can get another job elsewhere, but you can't do that anymore. You just can't, because there's not secure jobs really anywhere for a young person. They're like rare as hen's teeth, so if they get one, they're going to grab it, whichever sector it's in, and it's not going to be in ours. The other issue is they're looking at the people they work for, looking at people like myself, sort of approaching 40, and saying, well, where's this career going? Right? My boss Thomas, he's approaching 40, he's got a couple of kids, he still can't buy a house. What the hell am I doing? I'm 35, I'm 30. Why am I doing this? Right? And the reason they're doing it is because they love the work and they love helping people, but there's a limit to how much people can give. And then that brings me to my third point, which is I think student debt is a major contributing factor into why we don't attract young people into social justice. And I've thought that ever since I first came into working, I started working in community legal centres and then I went into the union movement. But I always thought, even then with the debt that I had, that this was a real sacrifice, that not only as someone who's working in the community legal centre environment or in a union environment, that you're taking a pay cut to do that, and you can accept to do that because you understand that the work that you're doing is not to accumulate profit for someone else, but actually to help people. But then on top of that, to be told, well, you did a law degree, lawyers make a lot of money, so your HECS is going to be a lot higher than everybody else. It's just an insult, right? Because most of the lawyers in our sector are not making more money than anybody else. They're making less money than most of our members. If you particularly blue collar unions, the membership is making a lot more money than the people who are serving them. So I really think this real force of neoliberalism that has driven young people into such a precarious situation when it comes to their ability to earn, but also the cost burden upon them, really is not. It's not that it's discouraging them from working in the sector, it's driving them out of our sector. There's something else that neoliberalism has done that I think is worth observing as well, which is that it is reshaping the culture of young people. And I talk through my job to a lot of teachers, and they tell me 20 years ago you would have students in their final year of high school, and when you ask them what do you want to do with your life, they'd say I want to do something that has a purpose, social purpose. I want to serve people. I want to help people. Whether they went on to do that or not, that was their aim when they were leaving high school. You ask them now, well, what are students saying to you? And they say, well, they want something that is going to fulfill them. Right? Money comes into it too, but they want something self-fulfilling. And I think that's really telling, because I think everyone wants to be fulfilled. But I think there's something now in our culture which is about self-actualization. It's about creating yourself as a productive human. And so the amount young people are investing in themselves, and I don't mean narcissistic in a kind of personality context, I mean in the sense of to become productive, to survive in a neoliberalist environment, you've got to invest in yourself. And universities really tap into it. I mean, you look at any of the advertising for courses, it's all about how you're going to make yourself more competitive, lifetime of learning. Make sure you're signing up to the latest course. This is going to make you a better worker. And so really the culture is now just driving these kids into this environment of, well, if I'm going to go get a job, what is that job going to do for my future career prospects? How is it going to train me up? What position is it putting me into? And in the social justice sector, that's not really my experience of how we work. Right? We're not there saying we're going to make you a better, productive individual, send you on to all these courses where you learn a certain corporate language and you're going to be able to market yourself and network yourself. What we say is we're going to send you out in my sector in the union movement, and you're going to be talking to a lot of workers, and you're going to find out what their problems are, and you're going to go to court, and you're going to advocate for them, or you're going to organise, and negotiate agreements for them. But that's going to become from real human interaction and understanding people and real collective interaction. It's the complete opposite of what this culture is driving. So I think I'll leave it there, but those are my real sort of key points and observations of what I've seen over the sort of past 15, 20 years that I've been working in this field.
I'd like to come back to you. Ben's just arrived in time for the throw again, because Ben can take what you've been saying and put it in the context of the broader social service sector who he represents. But I'd like to come back to you later, Thomas, and ask you about, particularly seeing as you're here, what role, if any, unions have in dealing with this in the sector. Ben, you heard what the account Thomas gave. Did that resonate with you, and how does that play out in the social service sector?
It did, and I apologise for having to step out. I received 6 missed calls from someone in a row, which normally means there's a drama. It has now been sorted. So I ignored the first 5. 6 seemed to be an excessive number. It was actually urgent, so I've now sorted it. So thank you for your patience. Ben McAlpine, acting CEO of NCOS. For those who don't know, NCOS is the peak body for the health and service system. Our members are not-for-profits across the state, so domestic family violence, neighbourhood community centres, homes and services and the like. Before we started, I said that my headline answer to this question would be similar. The crisis isn't looming, we're in it now. And then I had written, but there are reasons for optimism. Listening to that intro, I have to confess that my optimism took a bit off a whack. But why don't I maybe give a few stats that are relevant to our social sector, and then maybe I will remember why I did have some sense of optimism before coming into the room. So what we just heard is absolutely true across the social sector. So a few stats from a range of different studies recently, looking at staff turnover and retention. So the survey showed that a bit more than 50% of New South Wales CEOs and senior managers believe that staff turnover in their organisation is too high. And another 50% of workers were not certain that they would still be in the sector in the next 5 years. So senior managers are, to put it bluntly, freaking out that they don't have the right people, and they're losing their good people, and the people who are still staying don't see themselves there in 5 years. And so then we know that also huge growth is needed in our sector. So we need to be really good at retention, and we're really struggling. So what about recruitment? 70% of those senior managers said it's become more difficult to attract and retain staff. And that was particularly difficult for those groups with lived experience and particular demographics of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for example. and vacancies were increasing by over 2.5 times. I'm now at this point saying, why was I possibly optimistic? So what are some of the things? Exactly what we're just hearing. So low pay, insecure work. Something like 50% of the workers in the sector are on casual or fixed term contracts. They face part-time hours, so it's very common for people to have multiple part-time jobs. But as if you lose one of those, that can be incredibly difficult for any household. And then we hear a lot around insufficient professional development and career opportunities. And then layer on top of all of that, the stress and burnout that we're seeing, particularly after successive pandemics, fires, floods, it's pretty grim. And then on top of all of that, you layer on the cost of living crisis that we're living in. So even before the cost of living crisis, we did some research that had over 1 million people living in poverty in New South Wales. And since then, that number will only certainly be higher. That was a 2021 census. Costs are going up, housing stress is just through the roof. That's a bad pun, unintended. But if we're looking at those people on lower incomes, they are doing it tougher and tougher, and the people that are in our sector are on lower incomes. So the only sign of optimism that I do have is that the New South Wales government, I think, clearly understands the problem. They understand the scale of the issue. And one of the commitments they put in place is the awkwardly named and difficult to say Secure Jobs and Funding Certainty Task Force, which is going to look at all of this for the sector of New South Wales. So, the ASU is heavily involved in that. So there's a jobs compact, pay, looking at funding certainty around the slightly ridiculous scenario where you will have 12-month contracts for a local organisation. So they give 12-month contracts to their employees. So they then every 9 months start freaking out, well, do I actually have a job at the end of the year?
So maybe that's the optimistic bit.
No, well, it is the
policy
optimistic.
changing off.
And then what I was going to probably add later, but I feel like it should be added now, is the knowledge that there are people like us who are fighting for this every day. Even though people might be looking at you, Tom, and saying you might be not in the role because you've got 2 kids and struggling to pay for a mortgage.
If you try to be an example to these younger generation, when I was coming up, there were people who had made a successful career.
Yeah, and it is harder. And there was a fairly sad comment where someone said that they feel like they can only be in this job because their partner earns a big pay. And if that's the kind of scenario where we're getting to, that's going to be a serious problem for the sector in social justice broadly.
Thank you. And you have worked in the community legal sector, in the tertiary education sector, and now have sort of not responsibilities and unfair burden, but oversight of the place of women in Australian society. Can you give us your perspective on this?
Thanks, Simon, and I also wanted to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also recognise any Indigenous people who are joining us tonight. So perhaps I'll take a slightly different approach and thinking about, well, if the question is around recruitment, is there a crisis? And I don't think there's a crisis in the way in which you've been talking about. In my experience, there have been many people who want to get into social justice work in community legal centres, in community agencies. There is no shortage of people wanting to get into that work, and perhaps I'll just break that down at people and predominantly women who work in the social justice sector. So it's not about getting people in. I think it is, and what I would agree with my previous 2 colleagues on this bench is around proper recognition of the value of the work. So that, yes, that is an issue, that is a crisis. But in actual people trying to get in and recruitment, no, I don't see it. But with retention, yes, but not recruitment. But recruitment, I would qualify it, because if we look around the sector and see who is working in this industry, who works in social justice work, And we can see that it is a highly feminised industry, and that doesn't then surprise us as to why it's underpaid and undervalued, because as we've just seen this week with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency statistics, there is a real correlation between highly feminised industries and low paid work. So that's a part of our understanding of why working in social justice isn't valued to the degree that it is. The piece where I think there is concerns, I probably wouldn't put it as high as a crisis, is who works in our agencies and whether or not we really are attracting the full range of our community in social justice. So you touched on this, Ben, in terms of First Nations people working in our industry, culturally, racially marginalised people working, people with disability, LGBTQI+, I think are represented in our industry. But thinking about that full range of people, I think that is an issue, and that's something that we need to do a little bit of introspection around. What is it? How are we excluding? What are the barriers? Why is it not attractive? How are we structured that's actually excluding people from social justice work? So in terms of the issues around workforce in social justice, I think we do have real issues, and that is around proper pay and recognition of the absolutely fundamental nature of the work that we do, and also ensuring that we do have that breadth and full representation of our community in our sector. One of the things that perhaps I'd highlight just around why it is that our sector is attractive to women, it is for purpose. It offers flexible work. It has good paid parental leave generally. And there is that, it's very much often flat structures within social justice agencies as well. And I think all of that makes it an attractive workplace, particularly for women. And that's why, who knows which came first, but in terms of the nature of our workforce, I think that explains a little bit of why women would stay in it as well. Those are some of the real barriers to gender equity and pay gap, is around some of those key issues around flexibility, being able to have managerial positions at part-time rates as well, which is also something particularly significant for women in social justice agencies. So those would be my initial thoughts, Simon.
I wonder if we'd be asking the same question if, this is entirely hypothetical, the sector were predominantly men, not women. Is it the nature of the work? Is it the fact that the work is of its nature in some ways precarious because it's grant funded, government funded, it's not commercial, it doesn't generate its own, it doesn't sustain itself?
I think there are many areas though of our workforce that do have precarious work, and certainly social justice, but all the there's lots of precarious work areas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Emily, let's narrow things down and hear how this is playing out in the community legal sector.
So thanks, Simon, and I'd also like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on unceded Gadigal land and pay my respects. For those of you that don't know, Community Legal Centres Australia is the national peak for community legal centres, surprisingly enough. So community legal centres make up a small part of the legal assistance sector broadly across the country, which also includes legal aid commissions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, family violence prevention legal services. So we are both part of the community sector and the legal profession. So workers in the community sector are paid under the SHADS Awards, so their wages sit on par with community sector workers. But often, we often peg ourselves against workers in the legal aid commission and in private practice. So I think certainly in our sector, people are talking about a crisis in the workforce. We have a midpoint review of the National Legal Assistance Partnership Agreement, which funds all legal assistance providers happening at the moment, and looking at the labour market and the impacts of pressures on the labour market on community legal centres' ability to deliver services is a really critical factor in that review. I would agree with many of the things that all of the panellists have said. I found myself nodding along to all of them. There's been a lot of work done in various states and territories across recent months looking at workforce. Yes, we tend to get younger women into the sector early. About half of our workforce is aged under 34. People stay in the sector 2 to 5 years and then they move to legal aid and private practice or to other government roles. And it's really that mid-career period where we have difficulty attracting and retaining staff. I think the points that I would add are really in relation to, we see that these issues really amplified in rural, regional and remote areas. So often in remote Aboriginal communities, regional communities, there's reduced access to services broadly. There are higher rates of disadvantage, and there is a kind of, creeping retreat from service delivery we now say quadruple R, but in regional, rural, remote and very remote communities. And so people are losing access to justice. So where we see, in cities, it might take 3 months to recruit a role. We're hearing from centres in the Northern Territory and far north Queensland that they're going 12 months unable to recruit lawyers and other professionals to their roles. In some cases, this means centres operating without a principal legal officer, so the person managing the centre is also acting as the practice lead, which creates huge pressures for workforce. And I think, picking up on the points around neoliberalism and the way that governments contract services from our organisations, CLCs particularly, like many community organisations, really prioritise frontline service delivery, and there's a massive underinvestment in kind of organisational infrastructure. So a survey that was done in Queensland recently found that, or maybe New South Wales, that only 1% of funding was actually put into staff wellbeing. So, we talk about the high levels of, and I think about 6% into, operations, HR, those kind of functions that actually create a workplace environment where you can support your staff. So there's high demand for services. People are dealing with people who are homeless, who are experiencing domestic and family violence. So there are pressures coming from all directions, and the capacity to invest in, in workers, in supports, but also in kind of career pathways and development where people can see a future for themselves is really, really difficult. So I might leave it.
Thank you. Rosa, you've been facing this for a long time. Is it looming or current, or how do you feel?
Yes. Is it on these things? Thanks for inviting me, Simon. I think I bring another perspective from English speaking. I've been in the field for 40 years, so it's a completely. I think it's a completely different perspective. Most of our people, my service is a grassroots service. We provide education, disability, for frail age and dementia specific, community business scheme, and we provide, we've been founded in the 80s to provide settlement to migrant refugees. And we're still doing that partly because we are an inner city type of service, so therefore a lot of migrants, they don't settle around here because of the cost of living, and also it's very expensive. And mostly they are in the West and Chatswood area. We're talking about Asian and Chinese and and other Korean, etc. Well, I agree with all the speakers here, what they've said, but for us, it's been a struggle continuously. We provide services in education and disability in 17 languages. So you can imagine the recruitment issue we have. And if it wasn't for a student to come on a student visa, 24 hours they can work, which they bring the language and the strength, which then we have to deal with recruitment, with training, etc., etc. We wouldn't be able to provide service to our cohort. So it's like a different world, you know, I feel, especially in the last 20 years, we have a slide back to almost most of the services, mainstream services are completely not providing much services to our migrant refugees for a lot of reasons. They don't have staff who speaks the language, they don't have budget, they don't allocate budget for interpreters. So everything has deteriorated to a point that when we get a case, it's just, it takes months because it's an accumulation of issues. And so you have to go through that, you tend to refer to other services, and they send back to us because they don't have the language or they don't have. So it's you know, it's another world. I'll call it another world. I don't think people realize. While in the past we used to get social worker students to help us, we found that their knowledge just deteriorates so much over the years. So they come and they are, you know, also we don't have enough staff to actually supervise these people.
Did you say that you are reliant on international students?
International students
on
now,
their
but before we
visa
used to
allowance?
rely also on students,
Yeah,
which
but
they
now-
do that community development component. And you know, it's become harder and harder because the core staff is also limited. And the other thing, I mean, of course, we recruit a lot of also, you know, bilingual residents who has a resident visa, of course, in different languages. And the pain is that we cannot secure a contract because it's linked to the funding coming from the federal government. You know, they say you know, now they've increased 15%, and God, they did that. So it's a better wages per hours. But if you have different languages, you cannot guarantee full-time work to these people. You know, because it's linked to the availability of hours. So, you know, yes, we are between, you know, the union say you have to do this, the government say you have to give full-time permanent position or part-time permanent. And yet in our industry, because of the languages, you can't do that because you only can offer a few hours for different languages. So it has become quite an issue. And we, you know, the government doesn't like that, the union doesn't like that, but the reality is what it is. And we cannot afford to do that. Because if something happens, let's say we lose 10 people that speak Italian, either they go to nursing home and the convalescent home, that amount of hours will drop dramatically. And so therefore we cannot guarantee that hours to that particular carer. So, you know, I can go on and on and on, but it's not as optimistic as
I'm going to,
my colleagues here.
well, I'm going to come back and ask all of you, give you a minute to think about a solution, a silver bullet. I mean, there are clear problems, but I think some things are converging, and the contract nature of our funding and the short-term contract nature of funding, which flows all the way through to security that you can't provide your workers, seems to be an issue. Whether it's soluble or not, I don't know. Just what do you think of that? I mean, I just had a question to ask you, particularly about your sector, that, as you know, I'm very familiar with too. The anomaly, and I don't know whether it happens in other fields. Broadly speaking, we can say that community legal centres and legal aid commissions are providing legal assistance. Much the same people, much the same areas of work. And I know we can divide it up, but stepping back, you say, okay, they are, broadly speaking, legal aid in capital. Why is it that the state will fund its own workers with salaries and conditions so much more advantageous to the money it provides to people doing analogous work?
That's a big question. And I imagine Anna would have something to say about that as well. So I'll have a crack, and then Anna, you might want to jump in over the top. I mean, I think there are probably lots of reasons for that, some of which are, you know, quite boring, and some of which may be more interesting. I think there is a gender aspect to it. So I think it is, you know, we look at the statistics for our sector, and not only are our workers feminised, and that's the same for legal aid commissions, but not to the same extent. The clients that community legal centres help are also mostly women, and the legal issues that, yes, I take your point, but the legal issues that community legal centres help with tend to be in the civil and family law space. So there are, different, I guess, the majority of legal aid clients are men, and they are men facing imprisonment, and there is a gendered nature to that. A lot of the work that community legal centres do is supporting people to contest government decisions about entitlements to, everyday rights like social security or the NDIS or, navigate the family law system or respond to domestic violence. So I think that is one aspect of it. I think the structure of the funding agreement plays a role in that as well. So under the National Legal Assistance Partnership is ostensibly a partnership agreement between the Commonwealth and states, which commits the Commonwealth to providing a certain amount of money, but does not commit the states to doing the same. And so states are left to distribute Commonwealth money and to add in additional funds if they would like to, which in our experience tends to mean that they give money to their institutional and community. And I guess the other point I would make briefly is that community legal centres grew out of community-based and student legal activism. So the work that community legal centres do is rooted in activism, advocacy, and protest, and to some extent that I think that plays a role.
Doesn't sound like the public sector, does it?
It's a core part of what we do and what we say we do, and a core part of our history, and I think that may play a role as well. But Anna, I'm very interested in your views, given your lengthy experience.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I was trying to think creatively around whether there would be any way of, because it is such a feminised industry, whether there'd be any way of bringing a wage case around the feminisation and undervaluing of women's work sort of systemically. But then I was thinking, well, who would you be bringing it against? You'd be bringing it against all of the community legal centres as employers. And then that sort of leads me down the point, in some ways legal aid has better pay because there are fewer legal aid commissions, and they are public service, but they're simpler. And one of the strengths but also disadvantages of community legal centres is there are so many of them, but they're all out of their community. But it also means that to achieve change across the whole sector, it is fragmented because of all of those individual centres. They're all operating individually. So there is the potential, though, as a solution that each community legal centre chooses how it pays its workers. So yes, there's an award, but you can always pay above award. And so whether or not a community legal centre decided to value the workers and pay them at a different rate is absolutely open to the community legal centre. And what goes against that, of course, is that absolute passion, commitment of the workers to work and do as much work as they possibly can for their community. So there's always going to be that tension of, well, we could pay ourselves higher wages, but we will see fewer clients and we will achieve less systemic change. So that's the challenge of it is open to community legal centres to do that, but as a whole, they haven't done that. Whereas legal aid commissions, there's 6 or 8 of them, and they're required to do so because of their other industrial instruments.
Thank you. Ben, I wanted to come to you. You might want to chime in on that, and just to broaden it, can you come back to the broader social services sector, seeing as I took us down that path? And 3 things that have arisen that I'd like to hear more from your perspective on. Rosa's point about multicultural services, the capacity to deal with diverse cultures and languages. Emily's point about the situation in regional and remote New South Wales, and that question of contracting and the limiting nature of contracts. In 3 minutes or less.
It's okay. So, not to make it harder for myself, to add a 4th point, just where I was jumping in, which I now regret doing. One thing that really shocked me, that I'm kind of embarrassed to say I only discovered earlier this year, is that the sector that we're talking about has one of the worst gender pay gaps of all industries across the economy. The equal, this is embarrassing, I'm going to get this wrong, the equal pay day was something like the 9th of October, which is an immensely long period of time at which it would take a female worker to be working for free to then meet, I've got the wrong way, I'm looking for you to correct me if I get this wrong. But it's trying to, by calendar day, how many days are you working for free as a result of earning less? And a big driver of that is we've all talked about the feminised workforce. Something like 75% of the sector is female, and I'm not going to get the number right, but it's in like the 20s or 30s percent of senior management are women, which is, I'm sure, one of the key drivers of that gender pay gap. So when you were kind of postulating, oh, maybe this is something to do with that, I'm sure it's also something to do with this issue that we have seen across the economy and our community around discrimination and inequality. So that was the comment to make. To your point around multicultural, regional, remote and contracting, I'll start with the easy one, contracting. What we need is longer term contracts. And I mean that from a government to an organisation, because what we're calling for is 5-year contracts, and in regional or at least rural and remote, and possibly some regional, it should be 7. And we talked about this beforehand as well. We have created a system in which it is seen as a good thing that not-for-profits compete against one another to win a grant. And as someone who has been involved in my previous role in tenders, it is such an enormous drain of energy and time for organisations. And this is possibly not the best example, because I am a big believer and big supporter of the NDIS. But one of the sad flow-on effects of introducing the NDIS was, and I used to be in the mental health space, all these organisations used to collaborate. We'd find ways in which to bring our funding together, and then the NDIS came along, and it really had a massive impact on the sector and how we work together. Now, one of those drivers was financial, obviously, but I think it was also a big change. You're going to go inside yourself, you're trying to figure out how on earth you deal with this. And we're seeing that start to come back. So longer term contracts is critical, because then a CLC or a DV, shelter, whatever it might be, can provide permanent contracts to their staff. Because at the moment, if it's a 1-year funding arrangement, they give a 12-month contract. Regional remote, I think the comment made earlier is the big one. We've got massive workforce challenges, and one of the issues that I think is really playing into this, and this is why, to add a little bit of tension to the panel, I like the point that maybe recruitment isn't a crisis. So I'll give maybe it's not yet. I'm very nervous that I don't see how we're going to come out of it, and how it won't end up being a crisis. Because if you just look at, people talk about meaning and passion, and you've got flexibility, parental leave, all these really important things. I think that balance is really shifting. People used to be willing and happy, really happy, to make that trade-off. What we hear from our members is that trade-off is now tipping, and if we're not in crisis on recruitment, we surely will be very soon. So at Multicultural, we hear Southwest Sydney as an example, a bit of a sneak peek on a piece of research that we're desperately trying to finalise, is looking at the immense increased need that is going to happen. So the New South Wales government talks a lot about infrastructure, but it's physical infrastructure, it's roads and houses to a degree, and public transport, which is all really important stuff. They don't follow that up with social infrastructure. You've got population growth and deep need in these communities, and there doesn't seem to be, at least there's not action that's clearly demonstrating we're going to need serious investment in social housing, homelessness supports, DV. We've got this population growth coming down to us. A truck was around this looming crisis. That's another crisis that maybe is a train. But we are going to need some serious investment and growth investment. And I think I've covered off those 3 points as best I could.
In a short time. Thank you. Thomas, I'm old. I turn to the unions for help in my work environment. People less so, or what can unions do about this? Is this a union kind of problem?
I think part of it is a problem that unions can help with. I think definitely the pay equity issue and the ability to run pay equity cases is something that the union movement has done in the past in limited extent, but is looking forward to doing more of now that we have better federal industrial relations laws that we actually can run these cases in a much simpler way. The previous way was far more complicated. It required you to find someone that was of the opposite gender but virtually did exactly the same job, but the same job for higher pay, and whereas now you can actually use a hypothetical, which makes it a lot easier. And I think in some of these areas we will see unions take up those cases, but that also depends on union membership, which is another area in which we're seeing rapid decline, absolutely rapid decline, and also a demographic cliff where 40% of union members are over 55, and so the next 10 years, almost half of union members will retire and unions will halve their membership if they don't start growing really quickly. So in that sense, union power to sort of do these sorts of things is a lot more limited than what it used to be. But definitely in terms of advocacy and lobbying, we're still quite active around these issues. To bring it sort of back to the social justice sector, something that I've sort of observed from working with a community legal centre next door to us called the Immigration Advice and Rights Centre. So we do a lot of work with them in relation to working with migrant workers, but that's a project we do together. Most of their core business, I think it's almost 70 or 80% of their core work is assisting women in domestic violence situations come off partner visas and onto other substantive visas so they don't have to stay in violent relationships. They had their funding cut by $300,000 under the previous Liberal government. Labor came in and they have spent the last 12, hell, it's been 6 months going around and trying to get this funding renewed, and unfortunately just can't get any access to the right people, and so have had to actually lay off staff and reduce the people they're assisting. And now the reason I raise this example is I think it goes to this point about why community legal centres in a different situation to legal aid. And I think yes, there's probably the fact that community legal centres pay on award and could pay above award, but I think the other really important thing to note about community legal centres is they often deal with the forgotten people. Legal aid, I mean, it does all sorts of work, but predominantly is dealing with people who end up in our courts, right? And they get to court, and the magistrate says, well, who's representing this person? I know we don't have a right to a lawyer in Australia, but generally we expect a lawyer to be there. In my previous life, working in community legal centres, being in the courts, you can see the magistrate will send that person off to legal aid to get representation. But when you're dealing with the forgotten people, you're dealing with women in domestic violence situations, or you're dealing with, in my case, in the centre that I was working for, which is the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre, homeless or people in terminal illness in severe situations, often in prison, not getting the medication that they need. These are forgotten people where there is no judge who's automatically looking at that case is going to say, oh, you need this service, someone has to be there. And when they get forgotten, they just fall through the cracks, right? And it just happens, and we're seeing this now. We're seeing as homelessness increases. We look at the stats, it's happening. And it's happening in part because there isn't enough services out there to do this. But the reality is the state can kind of ignore it because it's not their problem. They're not in front of the state's judges, there aren't people that do that. So I do think that's one of the reasons that sort of governments can get away with not funding community, because these people just become statistics and they can just ignore it.
Thanks, Thomas. Rosa made a point that I want to pick up and see if what the rest of you think about this. I took one of the points you were making, Rosa, was the challenge you have in securing skills. So it's not just money on contracts and so on, but actually having people. So when Anna says, and I agree, my experience is that there's no shortage of our law graduates who want to go and work in social justice bodies, but it may be that you said that social workers have dropped off. So there's a challenge. One of the looming crises is not in recruiting generally, but perhaps in recruiting the skills you need in social justice. That's your experience?
Yeah, and the fact that also, the dismantlement of TAFE in the last number of years. The last 15, 20 years we have seen a lot of elimination of law, like TAFE and some other courses which they were free, and so therefore people were getting the training. And now there is some federal funding which, they realize that skill is really short. There's a shortage of skill in the community, and they want to, help people by not paying a fee to attend TAFE. But it's a lot of burden, it's with us. We still have to, when we employ people, the priority is the language. So we do a lot of in-house training ourselves because that's his priority number one. And then we channel them through, if we can find free courses in different institutions and so on. But the secure a job and more permanent job, it's all has to do with a new formula that the government has implemented. And unless, something's done to go back to actually block funding, you have this situation all the time, because it's a commercial formula, it's a business formula.
Ben, are you aware of a skills shortage as a dimension of this in the sector?
So if I use my mental health hat, where I can speak with some confidence, clinical expertise and skills is a real issue. And this example of we're saying, what if organisations chose to pay them more? I'm obviously oversimplifying a little bit, but there are a number of instances where we were caught between what our staff said that they needed to be paid to stay and what the government was willing to fund. And we saw a lot of people, particularly these clinical roles, would take a role in government because they got paid more. Or it's this burnout thing and it just wasn't enough for them anyway, and they leave the sector completely. So there is certainly, that's an example, there are certainly certain types of skills and capabilities that will already be under immensely higher levels of pressure than others, for sure.
I'm just giving you all notice, turn things over in your head. I'll come and ask for audience questions in a couple of minutes so you can start preparing yourselves. I can see Mary's well prepared, but we'll get to it. When I was researching this, an interesting, different perspective came up, so I'm hitting this with you, hitting you with this afresh. One of the discussions I had with someone in the sector was a consequence of the way in which the sector is funded is that the funders, Commonwealth and the state, make really serious accountability and acquittal demands, which doesn't just take time, but requires a level of professional expertise that conventionally the sector hasn't had. We've always kept good books and we're accountable, but the generalised, the social service sector is having to professionalise in a way that it didn't before. To attract accountants into the sector, for example, is costing money with expensive frontline services. And there's an indirectly imposed increase in managerial roles at the expense of frontline services because of what is seen to be unnecessarily onerous accountability and acquittal demands. Rosie, you're nodding.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot.
But I'm an accountant, so
Am I aware of this in the
I think the pressures are there in the community legal sector, particularly for smaller organisations, and it's an area that community legal centres really struggle. So, for the most part, centres don't have senior operational roles. There isn't that, there isn't an HR function, there isn't bookkeeping, and I think community legal centres, for the most part, are really far behind on this. I think we've been running a bespoke data collection system for centres nationally that is just so far behind modern reporting standards, and we're now facing the prospect of needing to transition the entire sector to a new data future within 18 months that has everybody terrified. Like and we hear from people that have done it, that have adopted modern legal practice and case management systems, that it's revolutionary, but centres simply don't have the resources to adopt the systems in the first place, or the technical expertise. And you talk about the wage differential between community lawyers and government lawyers. Well, in the IT sector, there's probably not many people willing to come and work at a small community legal centre to help them move into the modern age in terms of data. And at the same time, we're being requested to provide unit level data to the ABS using really unfit for purpose technology. So yes, that's a big issue for us in our sector.
And we would see that across the entire sector. So expectations as a general rule have increased, but the funding hasn't kept pace. So be it managerial skills, I'm also an accountant by trade way back in the day. Cybersecurity is something that's really becoming a problem now. Technology in general, and this is a real personal bugbear of mine. To have good investment in an organisation, you should be looking at, and this is always a sensitive subject, about, let's say, 13, maybe 15% of your funding should go to corporate back office functions. And that is, depending on your definition, that could be way too low. It could actually be 20 to 25, depending on what you're including in it. There are funders who cap it at 10. No more than 10% can go to anything that isn't service delivery. And there are some, like neighbourhood and community centres, who do amazing work in our community, and they get no core funding for a manager. None. There is one in kind of central eastern Sydney that pieces together 23 different grants and skims a little bit off the top for all of them, and that gets them to fund a manager part-time. There is no way that an organisation can be sustainable without investing in its own future if that is the environment in which it's trying to operate. And that has then obvious flow-on effects to the well-being and desire to stay in the sector for its workers.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the panel to each of you. Finish with a thought before we finish. Could you direct your questions either to the panel generally, through me, or to one of them in particular, and I will, Ashley will go with a mic, which helps the traction, and I'll ask you to ask a brief question to the panel and just get the response. Mary, can you lead off?
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Is that on? Yes. My name is Mary Crock. I'm a professor here. I started with a very big law firm, left to go and start the Victorian Immigration Advice and Rights Centre back in 1989, a long time ago. There's so much about what you've said here that sounds very, very familiar. And my little organisation is still running as Refugee Legal. And it made me think, why? How is it still running after 30 plus years? I can't count. I'm not an accountant. And the question I've got for the panel is, it seems to me that this specialist legal centre, I think, has held together and actually flourishes, doesn't have trouble recruiting, to the best of my knowledge, for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that it has adopted the practices of a proper legal centre, and I think in some ways coming from the biggest law firm in Melbourne to start this organisation gave me a massive head start, because I came in with some basic training about how a legal practice should run, with ideas about case management, etc. But I think significantly it's also merged, so that there's no longer a refugee and a migration centre. I arc up here, didn't merge with RACS, and I think both organisations have struggled for that reason. But both are now surviving because they are prepared, and this is the question I have for you, they're working with private organisations, seconding people. I'm just wondering whether we need better public-private collaborations in the community sector, such that I know that our focus has been on the law, but you can think about it in other social services areas too, where you've got big organisations. Joseph Assap is an absolute Mozart translating. You know, if we can partner one-on-one or generally
Let's see what they say.
get the legal profession to put cash on the table. So that
Any thoughts on public-private partnership? We'll leave cash on the table for later. Partnerships? Yeah.
So I absolutely, I think trying to build those collaborations with the private profession within legal, I don't know so much about the broader sector, and I think community legal centres have been really adept at trying to build those collaborations, and there are many, I think every community legal centre would have strong relationships with the private profession, the bigger firms, medium, the whole way down, and I think that's, you know, one of the strengths, but I don't think that's never going to be obviously a substitute for having well-paid ongoing workers within community legal centres, because that there is a special skill set that's attached to being a good community lawyer, and it's not the same as being a private lawyer, so in a private firm. So I think we have to recognise that professionalism and high level of expertise that community legal centre lawyers and legal aid commission lawyers demonstrate. So yes, there is so far that we can go with that, but it's never going to be a substitute for good funding for community legal centres. And the other point, just in terms of funding accountability, community legal centres also get funding from lots of private foundations, from local councils. So it's really a complex way of having to justify. So it's not even just government, or two levels of government. It's so many ways in which that admin function has become much more complex.
Anybody else?
I just want to jump in just because I am in a partnership with IAC, so I feel I should just talk on behalf of them. They are a very well-run centre and they will continue to do really good work, and they partner with us. We're not a for-profit organisation, but still it is a partnership. They do a lot of work with private law firms. They do have a lot of private law firm junior lawyers come through and volunteer with them. But unless we want to actually privatise our community legal centres, I don't think we should sort of fall down the trap of saying, well, they should be completely dependent on private endowments. Like, it's great that refugee legal in Victoria is able to fund itself this way, and I often think that IAC should just change its name to refugee legal as well, because they do a lot of refugee work, and it does seem that part of the sector gets really good funding, just the nature of it. But that's also the problem, is that the forgotten people don't get the funding. So when I was at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre, we got no funding from private donations because no one wanted to touch us. It was not a fashionable thing to be donating to at that time. And that's the real point, is do we want our community centres to be dependent on private endowments, which are going to be dependent on fashion, or do we want to actually make sure forgotten people are looked after and have a better funding scheme that's more sustainable?
Rosa, does this work for you?
Yeah, I guess funding. Yeah, we have partnership. We have partnership with STARS, because the nature of the work we have. But again, whenever you apply for funding, it's more the administration component of it than what they're giving you. So you have to balance out: do I have these people to actually write submission for $5,000 or $10,000 when really, it's not even worth it because you pay that in wages.
Yes.
Yeah. So all of these contributed to.
Question? Yes.
This is not a question actually. My name is Maya. I'm a student from PGS. I believe what Thomas was saying, it's for the new lawyers now. It's the debt of studying law is very, very heavy for us. I do suggest most probably if we could ask the government to give an incentive for new graduates, new lawyers, for those who wants to do the social, with the social justice agencies to work there and give something, an incentive for them, like for example, just to balance a bit with the pay that they get and deduct it from the HECS for the debts. I think that would be actually a good incentive for the students to, like me, I'm really eager to go to your sector, but I'm looking at, what I'm finished, I'm gonna have 180K debts. Of course, if you're just new, you're going to think about, I have to earn more money, so there's no, so we know exactly what we need. If the government give us that incentive, definitely a lot of students will be actually on there.
Thank you, that's really helpful information. Did any reflections on that? No?
Oh, I think I would just say, yeah, absolutely agree. And I think it's an area where, particularly in the context of the National Legal Assistance Partnership Review, is getting quite a lot of attention. So I think, there's a real interest in kind of HECS debt relief, really recognising that community lawyers are not going to generally go off to free hills and be earning, huge amounts of money, and creating kind of graduate programs, I guess, from universities into the sector where people can do clinical legal education placements, which Anna has expertise in, but then create pathways into the community sector and give incentives for people who then stay in the sector for a certain period of time. And I think recently ANU even started a program which kind of creates those links for rural, regional and remote communities. So often, again, it's those communities that miss out because, major institutions are based in cities, and so city-based centres can get access to those. So it's about then how do we extend those incentives into regional communities and look at things like access to affordable housing or loading for, increased cost of living in regional communities. So there's definitely interest from the independent reviewer of the NLAP in strategies like that.
And it needn't be particular to the community legal sector. That proposal would work in community services generally. Yes? Else? Okay. Question? Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm teaching human rights in Sydney Uni. My question is around retention. Obviously, there are differences in retention between different types of jobs in the social justice sector. But is there evidence or data as to people who leave the sectors or the different types of jobs? Where do they go? Do they go to other jobs that do relate to social justice, or do they go to other types of jobs? And what are these other types of jobs offering them? Thank you.
Ben?
I thought you meant through to me. I don't know, but I bet there is research out there. But one thing I can add is that one of the linked issues here was portability of entitlements. So long service leave is the easiest example. So you, in Queensland and Victoria and the ACT, they have a scheme that if you work in the sector but move between jobs, you can maintain and build up your long service leave entitlements and earn long service leave, even though you're in the sector, not an organisation. The New South Wales government is committed to doing the same in New South Wales, so we're watching that very carefully. But that's the type of thing that, there are plenty of stories that we hear from our members where people would leave for 2 or 3 years. A lot of it, and this is going back to the 75%, a lot of it is linked with raising children and families, and then they're trying to come back after 2 or 3 years and they don't have that portability of entitlement. But anecdotally, we also hear a lot about people leaving the sector to go into basically the same role in government, and they get greater pay, greater entitlements, that kind of thing. So that's an example.
And that's you were saying before, and that's the case in the community legal sector going into government.
Yeah, there does seem to be a stronger pathway from community legal centres into legal aid commissions than the other way around, particularly for that kind of 2 to 5 year sort of mid-career. But Queensland, the peak body in Queensland has done some research recently that shows something like 50% of people in community legal centres in Queensland are actively looking for work, but the preference that they state is that they would like to find a job in another community legal centre. So whether they're actually doing that, that's qualitative self-report data.
They're looking for work because they're on 12-month contracts.
Yeah,
They don't know what's coming next.
exactly. So I think there's a desire to stay in social justice, but it's at the end of the day, it's where they can get better entitlements. People can go to legal aid where there is still, it's still social justice. You're still delivering a service to people who need it. But definitely there's a trajectory from the sector into government.
Ed, yes.
Thank you. One of the things that is so special about community legal centres is that they're of their community. They're not just sort of an imposition. So, for example, our 80-year-old CLC, Kingsford Legal Centre, it is made up of lots of staff who are of the area, right? But Kingsford's now a bloody expensive place to live, and so we've seen this happen with teachers and medical professionals as well, that they can no longer afford to live in those communities. Are you worried that that's at risk of changing the kind of one of those really special fundamental elements of what a CLC is, or do you think that that's going to be dealt with in other ways?
I do think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it won't happen in the rural remote ones because that's their only workforce. But I think that the length of travel between workplace and where people live has I get a sense that has increased, and I think that's particularly exacerbated. We know that people who live in the West who have a greater burden in terms of that travel. So, and yet historically our community legal centres have been created in inner city where there isn't as much demand as there is in sort of the outer suburbs. So there is definitely that tension in terms of the workers and whether they are of that community. I don't know. I mean, I think there is that element, but I think there's always been, because it's a legal profession, I think it depends on which workers within the centre in terms of who's actually of the community. Emily, you might have some thoughts.
No, I would say, I think it is becoming a pressure even in those regional communities. I mean, we hear from, members in those places that, people can be, young lawyers fly in and fly out. So I think it is something that, even centres in those places are really struggling to create those pathways within their community and maintain that real sense of community embeddedness that we like to talk about. And, I think to some extent, historical funding models and the allocation of funding based on, historical decision making plays into that a little bit because, strict contractual requirements or, measurements of legal blah, 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 they limit the capacity of new centres to emerge. So, there was a period 50 years ago where, centres sprung up in response to need and they, and centres remain agile and remain flexible, but these constrictions from the outside are really kind of, I think, starting to limit that sense of community embeddedness, and that's something we really need to grapple with as a sector. I mean, I think in the cities it's that, we're becoming less community oriented to some extent, and the opposite, people are leaving regional areas, and the struggle is different.
There's no right point at which to stop this, but I'm going to stop it and ask each of you just with a sentence, reflect on leave us all with a thought coming out of today. So if you just turn your mind to how you'd like to sign off with a sentence. I'll ask the panel to give us a one-sentence reflection, and then I will announce and present the winner of the essay prize, and then there are refreshments outside in cooler air. Just hang in there and we'll get there. Thomas?
Apart from, I think we just need to pay everyone more, I think I really like the comment from the woman who talked about student debt moratorium. I think it makes a lot of sense that if someone is working in social justice, they shouldn't be held to be paying off their student debt, particularly at the high rates that have been designed based on them earning a lot more money because of their degrees. So I think that's a great idea and something that is probably worth pursuing further.
Thank you.
I think one thing we haven't talked about, I think we've touched on, is really around impact and how we value what we deliver to communities. And I think part of what we need to do is shift the conversation to the outcomes that are delivered to communities, to these people, to the people in the communities that are on the margins, and actually value the work of our sectors in terms of the outcomes that they achieve for people and communities, and not the value that they deliver to government in a dollar sense.
Okay, you're right. We haven't touched that, let's speak. Yeah.
For some reason I am still feeling optimistic, but that won't be my final comment. There's been a thread through this whole thing, housing. We have to grapple with housing affordability in this country, and this conversation, like the CLC example, shows those hidden ripple effects through the entire community when you are in a situation where you may be not able to have a CLC as an example that reflects its local community, and that has true value. You can't put a number on that, but that has immense value. And if we don't get our hands around this high housing crisis, this is a great example of some of those issues that we don't talk about because it's just it's too small and also too big at the same time. But that's a key theme to me that I think we need to keep in mind.
I'm grappling with is there some way of having some creative litigation around the feminised nature of the workforce, and is there any way of trying to deal with that in a litigation way? So that's sort of an interesting thought to stick with. And then I also liked I think the moratorium, I think that's a creative way as well to get at some of that attraction of people in. And then I would just go back to the point I made at the beginning. The issue around recruitment, we still do need to diversify our workforce. We're not actually getting the full breadth, and having come from Western Sydney University where there's such rich cultural diversity there, we don't see that in our social justice sector. So that's a challenge for us all.
It's a real leading through, Rosa.
Yes, I guess for me it's part of what Tan was saying, but it's access, equity and inclusion. It must come into it, because there is a great abyss between mainstreaming and ethno-specific and migrant centre. It's just like living in another country, and unless we do that, the more division, more racism will become rampant, and that's what I like to leave: access and inclusion.
Thank you very much. Could you please thank the panel for